Well, by way of introduction, we all know only too well that U.S. relations with Iran have been fraught with tension ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. After 35 years of conflicted engagement with Iran, the U.S. and the West crafted a nuclear deal in 2015 aimed at controlling and delaying Iran's path to producing a deliverable nuclear weapon, only to have it derailed by President Trump 3 years later. In the interim, tough economic sanctions have not deterred Iran from further enriching uranium, bringing them within months of achieving nuclear bomb capability. As we speak, diplomatic efforts are underway in Vienna to try to resuscitate the deal in some form, but prospects for success are very discouraging so far. So to put it briefly and mildly, we are facing an increasingly unstable and dangerous situation in the region. Now, given this backdrop, we are incredibly fortunate to welcome Vali Nasr as our speaker today. I think his visit could hardly be more timely given what's going on in Vienna. Vali is the Majid Khoduri Professor of International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Between 2012 and 2019, Vali served as Dean of the International Studies School, and prior to that acted as a senior advisor to Richard Holbrooke, who at the time was a special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Vali has authored half a dozen books on both Iran and the Middle East, and his articles appear frequently in both foreign affairs and foreign policy magazines, among others. So Vali, thank you so much for joining us today. And now I will turn the podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Tyler, and thank you for inviting me to this session. It's really wonderful being with you. And as you mentioned, this is a very timely session. It's the right time to be talking about this topic. And Iran has now become perhaps one of the more critical and as well as difficult foreign policy challenges before the Biden administration and the United States. And it is now the single most important issue that in some ways could derail the administration's foreign policy vision, which is to focus on Asia, focus on climate, to de-emphasize the Middle East, because it's the one issue that can suck the United States back into the region in a major way. So let me first begin by saying, how did we get here? Because that's very important to why we can't move forward from here. Tyler already mentioned that Iran and the United States had a fraught relationship since the hostage crisis of 1979-1980. They have no diplomatic relations. They don't talk to each other directly. Iran has been contained and under various kinds of sanctions and pressure by the United States over the past 4 decades. So in 2015, President Obama's initiative to have a nuclear deal with Iran was very significant at multiple levels. First and foremost is that it froze and shrunk the Iranian nuclear program in a verifiable manner. Secondly, that it was the very first time that Iran and the United States actually had meetings face-to-face, arrived at an agreement that they both were willing to sign on to and to implement. So the nuclear deal of 2015 was not designed to be the end point, but really to be the beginning point. And in fact, the expectation was that if the nuclear deal continued, that if it was implemented, if it built trust, that it would be possible to then have follow-on negotiations, both on nuclear issue, as well as on other sets of issues between the United States and Iran. And of course, it was, as a first step, it was not supposed to be bringing, sort of 1,000 flowers of peace between them, but it was a significant diplomatic achievement. Now, it's important to note that Iran did implement the deal. There were 12 reports by the International Agency that monitors the nuclear issue that verified that Iran was implementing the deal fully. Now, if people don't like the deal, or they thought that there should have been more in the deal, that's a whole different issue. But Iran did implement what it signed onto. It didn't violate, it didn't drag its feet, it didn't cheat. It implemented those aspects. The United States did to some extent, but in fact, the United States and Europeans did far less in implementing their part of the deal than in fact Iran did in 2015. Then comes in President Trump, who immediately begins to back away from the deal. And then in early 2018, he actually pulls out from the deal completely. So for the reason for pulling out of the deal was that this deal was signed by his predecessor. He didn't like it. He thought he could do better, that he was caving into people who all along did not want to deal with Iran at all. And above, and most importantly, probably he caved into the influence and persuasion of the Israeli prime minister at the time, Bibi Netanyahu, that it would be in America's advantage to come out of the deal and that Iran could be forced to sign a better deal. Now, at the face of it, this is bad foreign policy, because if you sign a deal and then you backtrack on it and for no good reason of the other side being cheating, come out of it, you shred all trust. Why would Iran agree to negotiate a new deal with the Trump administration when it has shredded the last deal? What guarantees you have that every time you sign a deal, you implement it, you dismantle your nuclear infrastructure, you spend a lot of money doing that, all of those things, and then the United States backtracks and says, you know, I want to restart again. And so the Iranians were not enthusiastic about a new deal, and they didn't want to reward the Trump administration's attitude towards diplomacy. So the Trump administration retaliated by putting Iran under tremendous amount of economic sanctions, what they called maximum pressure strategy. Now, the assumption of the maximum pressure strategy was that either the Islamic Republic will completely collapse altogether and there would be regime change in Iran, or that the Islamic Republic would come to its knees and agree not only to a new nuclear deal, but perhaps to agree to a much broader set of things domestically, regionally, with its ballistic missiles, etc. And initially, there were some demonstrations in Iran. There was a popular upheaval in Iran, and actually, ironically, that made the Islamic Republic more determined to resist the Trump administration, because to them, they didn't believe that the Trump administration actually wanted a nuclear deal. They believed that the Trump administration wanted regime change, and they were going to resist regime change and that kind of an effort. And so they did not come to the table. And as they did not come to the table, the Trump administration kept escalating economic pressure on Iran. During its time in office, the Trump administration put 1,700 new sanctions on Iran, across the board, virtually making any kind of a trade, even in drugs, medicine, humanitarian issues, virtually impossible with Iran. The Iranian economy, however, did not collapse, although the Iranians were impoverished. Average Iranians suffered. 10% of Iran's middle class fell below the poverty belt. There were shortages of food of various kinds across the country. It created a lot of unhappiness, but also a lot of the popular unhappiness was directed at the United States and not just at the Islamic Republic. And that's one reason why the regime in Iran was able to survive. And then beginning in 2019, the Iranians decided that they had to basically establish some kind of a deterrence with the Trump administration, and that they had to show the Trump administration that its policy had cost, and that it cannot keep pushing and pushing and pushing, because that will end up in war at some point. And that they had to back the US off. And also that if they were ever going to go back to the table with the US, they had to have some kind of leverage, because they had already given up all of their leverage to get the 2015 deal. So they started to resume the kind of nuclear activity that they had given up under the 2015 deal. They started enrichment. They started rebuilding the cascades of centrifuges. They restarted their research activity. I mean, when President Trump came to office, the weight of Iran's low enriched uranium was almost the same as the weight of the president. By the time that he left office, Iran had accumulated about 3 tons of low enriched uranium, and it was beginning to also accumulate 20% enriched uranium, which it was not supposed to do so. So, and then the Iranians also began to become much more aggressive at the regional level. They attacked oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, tankers in the Persian Gulf, and then we had a tit for tat with the United States when the US assassinated the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, and the Iranians lobbed about 100 missiles on a base which housed US troops, which is a very audacious act. And there was a 48-hour period that the two countries almost went to war, which is something that supposedly President Trump did not want and had thought that the maximum pressure strategy would never bring the United States to that point. So by the time that Biden-Trump administration left office, Iran had become both more lethal and also more aggressive. And it had shown that it was willing to push the United States much harder. So the US basically was choking Iran's economy, and Iran had begun to kick hard, and there was a chance of escalation. During the campaign for presidency, President Biden had hinted that he would go back into the deal. In fact, there was one point, even in the presidential debate, the question was asked of all the candidates, and everybody said they would go back into the deal. That created an expectation among Iranians that President Biden would quickly break with President Trump on an international agreement like the Iran nuclear deal, just like he was going to do on the climate deal and on other deals. That he would come in, provide some kind of a signal of his intentions, and that some kind of a discussion would begin pretty quickly about how the United States was going to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, the so-called JCPOA as it's known, on a basis of compliance for compliance. In other words, Iran would go back into 100% compliance, and the US would go back into the deal fully also complying with its economic obligations. In Iranian mind, that meant that all of those 1,700 sanctions that Trump had imposed for no good reason in Iranian view would be lifted. Now, it didn't pan out that way. President Biden came into the office all of a sudden showing no urgency in going back into the deal. Perhaps some of his advisors may have told him that you should let Iran basically sit under sanctions, and the longer the sanctions go on, the softer they may become and more easy to deal with. And one has to know that sanctions are on no cost to the United States, and all the cost is on the other side. So there was no urgency here. There is also possible that some of his advisors told him that Iran is a very hot button issue domestically in the US, and he doesn't want to spend political capital on Iran when the Senate is 50-50, when the country is divided, when we're in COVID, in a bad economic situation. Why would you want to start an issue that is going to bring some Republicans and all of the Republicans and some Democrats into opposition to you? Didn't you see what happened with Obama when he negotiated the 2015 deal? The result was that the Biden administration showed no interest in talking to Iran right away, and didn't even take any humanitarian measures, signals like, for instance, allowing Iran to use some of its money to buy, let's say, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, etc. None of that happened. That actually deepened the gulf of distrust. The Iranians now became convinced that Biden was following basically Trump's strategy, and there was no difference between the two of them. And that Iran was going to only get somewhere if it became really, really dangerous. In other words, Iran now sees being dangerous as a negotiation strategy, that the United States only responds to alarm, that if Iran becomes more nuclear, more lethal, more aggressive, then the United States would actually come to the table. So it's at that point that the supreme leader in Iran basically says that Iran should go up to 60% enrichment. It should turn off the cameras of the International Atomic Agency monitoring. It should stop complying with a lot of nuclear commitments. and basically it should follow the path of becoming much more advanced on the nuclear front. Experiment, research, new facilities, more advanced centrifuges. And it's only when Iran does this that the United States starts agrees to negotiations in Vienna. So already the Iranian strategy paid dividend, that Biden only agreed to talk to Iran when Iran became more dangerous, and it became very apparent that time now was on Iran's side. You know, as the longer you waited, the more nuclear material they're going to have. Their economic situation is bad already, and they haven't collapsed, and there's not much more economic pressure you can put on them. But they can actually begin building leverage on us. There were 6 rounds of talks between Iran and the United States between May of last year until June. During this, the key to the negotiations was how quickly would Iran go back into full compliance with the nuclear deal? And secondly, for Iran, the question was that how much of those 1,700 sanctions would the United States lift, and how quickly would it do so? Now, Iran going back into full nuclear compliance at the beginning was more straightforward. Since then, it has become less straightforward because Iran has now learned so much that perhaps the 2015 nuclear deal it does not contain it the way it did in 2015. Like in 2015, the nuclear deal would move Iran back to about a year from breakout point, which is the time period you need to amass enough enriched uranium to build one single bomb. Although building it is a whole different process, but at least just getting sufficient amount of fissile material would have taken a year. The 2015 deal today would probably push Iran back between 6 to 8 months because of the level of know-how that they have gained over the past 2-3 years, since the United States left the nuclear deal and since they've accelerated their program in 2021. Now, for the United States, there was also other issues, and a lot of them is domestic. One is that the Trump years wasted a period of trust building. So some of the sunset clauses to the original deal come due in 2023, just before elections in the US, and that's domestically a hot political issue. So the US does not want to go back in a deal, some of the provisions of which would expire by 2023. Secondly, generally, the administration is very reluctant to go back to the same 2015 deal because Congress, Senate, the foreign policy establishment, the media could eat it alive. In other words, the administration wants to be able to say that they're getting a bigger deal, what Secretary Blinken called a longer and stronger deal. So we're not going back to the 2015 deal, we're getting a bigger deal. And here was a disconnect between Iran and the US, because Iran basically wanted negotiations for the revival of the 2015 deal, whereas the United States wanted to leapfrog over the 2015 deal in Vienna and really be laying the foundations for a bigger and stronger deal. But at the same time, the United States was telling Iran that we want a bigger deal, but we want to give you less than what we gave you in 2015, because we will not, or we cannot lift all of the sanctions that Trump put in place, because the Trump administration sometimes deliberately ascribe multiple designations to sanctions. Like these sanctions are for nuclear issue, but they're also for terrorism, but they're also for human rights, and they're also for this and that. So even if you went and said, okay, we need to lift them for nuclear reasons, you cannot automatically lift them for other reasons that have been also attached to the same set of sanctions. And this actually created a complication. Now, the Iranians also wanted another thing from the United States, and that was that some kind of a guarantee that the next American president would not do the same thing that Trump did. Or if Trump came back, that he wouldn't be able to do the same thing. Because for Iran, rebuilding a program, dismantling it, both are costly. And whereas for the United States, sanctions are just a piece of paper. There's no actual cost associated with lifting sanctions or imposing sanctions. Whereas for Iran, abiding by the deal and then not abiding by the deal, both are pretty costly. I mean, dismantling centrifuges, dismantling nuclear facilities, as well as building them are costly. And they don't want to be in a yo-yo situation where they negotiate with the Democratic administration and then a Republican administration comes in and reverses that. Now, the Iranians, they couldn't get to an agreement on that. When the negotiations stopped in June 5 months ago, this was a big issue. The US basically said we cannot give guarantees, but the Iranians said that there's no value to the deal if you don't give guarantees. Which foreign business would invest in a market when from yesterday to tomorrow you could go under sanctions and then you have only a few months to get out of that country and you have to leave all of your capital behind? Or Iran did not want a situation in which it sells oil and then its money sitting in a bank in South Korea and then it's all of a sudden frozen and they cannot access their own funds. So this became a major issue. Now, the problem, an added problem was that Iran had elections in May, June, and because there was no agreement, the Biden administration had to wait for a new hardline Iranian government to take over. The Iranian elections in the summer were important to Iran. It was in this election that the conservatives basically now have managed to take control of all of the major institutions. This is parliament, judiciary, presidency, the security forces. They're not just conservative, but it's the most hardline view, most distrustful of the West, most the ones who argue that it's futile to negotiate with the US, that the US will never lift sanctions, that there's no pathway forward with the West, that have now taken over in Iran. And one reason they were able to do so was exactly the collapse of the 2015 deal. Because the former Iranian president and his foreign minister and his team believed that the nuclear deal of 2015 was important in creating an anchor for Iran in relations with the West, with Europe and the United States. And that anchor over time would grow and would keep Iran moving gradually in the direction of the West and opening. They hoped that the nuclear deal of 2015 over a 10-year period would increase the size of Iran's middle class by 35%. And that middle class would have a vested economic interest in relations with the West. And eventually it would be that middle class voting and in other ways that would influence change in Iran. And when the United States basically pulled out of the deal, not only the trend reversed, in other words, as I said, that now 10% of Iran's middle class has fallen below poverty line, but they lost face domestically. They were accused of either betraying Iran in 2015 negotiations or having been naive and negotiated poorly and in the end, having given up Iran's nuclear program in 2015 without getting absolutely anything in return for it. And the fact that they were not able to arrive at a deal with the Biden administration before the elections basically meant that there was no path for the moderates to actually have a strong say in those elections. So the conservatives have come in, and last week was really the first round of negotiations with the conservatives. And they basically have taken a much harder line. They are demanding that the Biden administration lift more sanctions than their predecessor had perhaps agreed to in June. They are asking for guarantees from the United States. And they are basically have taken a much more hardline position in the negotiations. Now, that does not mean that negotiations won't go forward, because I do think the United States and Iran both have an incentive to come to an agreement. Iran needs sanctions lifted because domestically it's hurting the country severely. And also the Biden administration really cannot afford either war with Iran or Iran creating a major international crisis by getting closer and closer to nuclear capability. So I think that the two sides would like to get to a deal, but saying that is different from actually arriving there. They are both looking over their shoulder at their domestic constituencies. They both are afraid of the reaction of giving away too much and not getting enough at the table back at home. They are also worried about the terms of the agreement. For Iranians, the longevity of the agreement is pretty important, and they haven't got anything on that. Is this deal good for 6 months? Is it good for 2 years? If the Republicans are going to come in and upend it, what's the point of cutting a deal? Maybe they should just hang on until Republicans come in. And for the Biden administration, the strength of the deal matters a lot. They want to make sure that Iran's nuclear program is reversed to a point where it's no longer a major concern in the region. And then there are two other points which are important. One is the state of Iran's economy. There is no question that sanctions have bitten hard into Iran, but biting hard does not mean effectiveness. I mean, if we're measuring effectiveness by the United States being able to hurt a country's economy, we are very effective. But if we're measuring this by saying, can we actually change a country's attitude, a country's policy? Can we force it to follow the path we want? Then it's failed. It not only has failed, it actually has proven to be counterproductive. In other words, not only Iran did not come to the table, Iran actually has become, in terms of nuclear capability, far more dangerous. It has become more conservative and nationalist, and it has become, as I said, more lethal and dangerous in the region as well. So the maximum pressure strategy has not only not had produced results, but actually has made Iran a bigger problem than it was, and has left us with fewer angles of being able to tackle the issue. Now, domestically within Iran, the sanctions have had a massive humanitarian impact by creating food security issues, water issues, by denying the country access to international markets and pharmaceutical things, vaccines, etc. early on, when Iran was one of the countries most hard hit by COVID. And in fact, Secretary Pompeo almost played his hand of trying to use COVID as a multiplier beneficiary on top of his maximum pressure. And all of this has left a bad taste. In other words, we have not changed the behavior of the government, but we have really hurt the people. We have impoverished them. We have contributed to the death of people during COVID. We have followed the strategy of hurting the average citizen in order to basically using them as a ramming rod against a regime that is proven to be fairly resilient in that way. But the economic situation is dire, and it is an incentive on the Iranian government to come to the table, but it's not a guarantee that they would say yes to everything we want. And so bringing Iran to the table is different from getting them to agree to terms of a deal. Now, there are also other consequences. I mean, Iran has invested a lot in homegrown manufacturing. Its economy has become much closer to China than it was before the maximum pressure sanctions were put down. China is not a solution to Iran's economic problems, but it has been very important to keeping it afloat. And finally, is the issue of the region. You know, the region featured very prominently in conversations about derailing the nuclear deal of 2019. Iran has been active in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen. Some of these, like in Iraq, may have some defensive value to Iranian security forces. Others are about regional influence and putting their rivals on their back foot. So, there are different reasons, but there's no question that Iran has done well in the region compared to the Arab governments. It's still standing in Iraq and Lebanon. It technically won the war in Syria because Bashar Assad is still there, and the Arab campaign to dislodge him failed, and now Arab governments are rushing to recognize him. And in Yemen, Iran has managed to bog down Saudi Arabia in a quagmire that is not going in Saudi Arabia's direction. The Trump administration was hoping that maximum pressure would weaken Iran's hold on the region. That hasn't happened. In fact, Iran has become more dangerous as the attack on Saudi facilities, on tankers, etc., have shown. And then, under pressure, the Arabs have basically decided that they're not going to follow the same policy they did in 2015. They now are talking to Iran directly. I mean, today, as we're talking, the second most important person in UAE, Prince Tahnoon, the brother of the Crown Prince, who's the top national security person in UAE, has gone to Tehran. Iran and Saudi Arabia have started a dialogue in Iraq. And the Arab countries are not where United States and Israel are now, whereas in 2015, they were all in one camp. The Arab countries do not want war in the region. They don't want to be a target of Iran. They've decided that whether there's a deal or no deal, that the policy of that you cannot isolate Iran, and they're not going to get any footing elsewhere in the region. So they've actually started a policy of communicating with Iran and trying to reduce tensions at the least, and maybe even move towards normalization of relations with Tehran. Now, there's a lot of negative talk about this round, the round of Vienna talks that happened last week. I would say, yes, the talks didn't go swimmingly. I mean, if the expectation was that they were just going to show up and somehow there was going to break through, that was not going to happen. You have a new team coming in, it's going to get comfortable. It has to take a position that would telegraph to their own constituency at home that they're just not following, the script of their predecessors. There's a new sheriff in town, they have a new set of demands, and they're going to follow the negotiations according to their own script. The good news is that there's going to be another meeting in next week. Perhaps the two sides will come up with some formulas that could lead to continuation of negotiations. I think the issues that remain between them are hard. It's about how quickly sanctions would be lifted, whether Iran gets any kind of a guarantee that would give it a sense that this deal is worth it. And on the other side, the United States has to get some kind of satisfaction that Iran's nuclear program is going to go back in a box completely where it was in 2017 before the United States came out of the deal. As I said, that's not easily achieved, but it doesn't mean that there cannot be progress and we cannot have a breakthrough. I think the alternative is very, very dangerous for the region. It's very dangerous for Iran. It's going to be highly destabilizing for the region. And it also could get the United States sucked back into another forever war in the Middle East when it wanted to shift its focus to containing China, dealing with Russia, dealing with climate issues, etc. So success in Vienna, in my opinion, is of absolute importance to all sides. And failure in Vienna or any idea if there's a plan B, etc., is really courting disaster all across the board. Why don't I stop here? I'd be very happy to hear comments, questions, etc.
Oh, Vali, okay. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. And we all knew the storm clouds were gathering. I'm not sure we were quite aware how dark the sky had gotten. So pessimism seems to prevail. I guess the most obvious first question, which I'll ask, is, okay, given that the probabilities are very high that the talks fail or end up at loggerheads, what next? Let's say they leave, both parties leave Vienna without having achieved anything. what happens on both sides in terms of the subsequent developments?
So if, I mean, there are different kinds of failure. I mean, there might be a failure to say, let's get to a breakthrough in 1 or 2 sessions, and we're talking about February, March of next year before there is progress. That in itself is bad for the United States, because in the meantime, Iran keeps enriching and its program keeps becoming bigger. So you're basically negotiating against an ever-expanding program, right? And the reality of one of the mistakes of the Trump's maximum pressure is that if you give it your maximum and the other side doesn't fall completely, then basically you pretty much exhausted most of what you can do. I mean, short of naval blockade or bribing China with something big to cut them out of Iran, the US has pretty much exhausted all of its economic tools against Iran. But Iran actually has a lot more leverage on the US, which is this continuation of enrichment. If by failure you mean that the talks completely collapse, in other words, there's absolutely no agreement whatsoever, and the two sides basically go home and say there's no way forward, period, done, finished, then I think we're in a very dangerous situation, because Iran will then continue on enriching and expanding its program and taking it further on the ground. And the US will end up in a very difficult position of either having to accept the reality or having to do something militarily in order to stop it. And that military option is, we shouldn't be comfortable about it. I mean, Henry Kissinger always had a saying that you know how to start conflicts, you know how they start, but you don't know how they end. You know, as we know how we might start a conflict with Iran. You're going to bomb these sites, but we don't know how it's going to end and what the consequences of starting it would be. There's no sort of a clinical outcome with Iran that you're going to hit them, they're going to go their whole, they won't have nuclear capability. I think it would be the start of something much worse for the region. The Iranians would react across the region. It would destabilize things. Oil prices could go to $10 a barrel. And even if Iran collapsed, you know, you have a country of 80 million sitting in the most strategic part of the world, becoming something like an order of magnitude worse than Iraq was. So the outcomes of a failure and the nuclear deal is quite serious. And the voices in the US that oppose the previous deal, which are now should be held accountable for that, for helping sink that deal, and now may oppose it, have to consider what is the alternative here.
Right. Let's turn our view a little bit more to the West, towards Israel. What are the feelings now in Israel about this whole situation? Obviously, they view Iran as an existential threat. I don't think that attitude has changed any. How much patience do you think the Naftali Bennett regime will have if these talks continue to fail or not be productive, and the uranium enrichment goes towards full nuclear capability, which I gather the feeling is in 2 years, roughly, plus or minus a bit, they could have a deliverable bomb if they continue to enrich uranium at the current pace. Is that something you agree with?
Yeah, no, I mean, the timeline is definitely correct. I would say there's a number of things to keep in mind. One is that I really don't think Iran is an existential threat to Israel. I mean, it is a threat. But at this point in time, Israel has a much larger nuclear capability, has probably over 200 nuclear warheads, undeclared. It probably has nuclear missiles on Pershing missiles, on submarines right off of Iran's coast in the Persian Gulf. So in other words, it's not without means. It's not like Iran can annihilate Israel. This is more rhetoric, in my opinion, that is actually level-headed thinking. And also, so the Israelis obviously are very nervous, largely because of Bibi Netanyahu's arguments about the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, maximum pressure, proved to be a strategic mistake. Now there is a debate within Israel, which now a number of security officials have come out and said that the deal may have been not very good, but coming out of it proved to be a strategic catastrophe for the region. So for Israel again, I think a deal is the best thing to stop Iran's nuclear program from advancing. Because if there is no deal and you don't get an agreement with Iran that would basically stop its program where it is and created let's say a 8 to 12 month breakout period, then the only options are ultimately military, and that risks war. And again, for Israel, the consequences of that is unknown. I mean, the idea that this is not Iraq 1980, that you would say there is one nuclear site, you bomb it, and the Iraqis cannot do anything about it. Now, about the breakout time period, the 12-month time period to be able to build a bomb, that's really about the amount of time that's required to produce enough fissile material for one bomb. Turning into a bomb takes a lot more time. And also, one bomb is not enough for a country to be a nuclear power. As Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, one bomb is an invitation to be attacked. You need 30 bombs before you are credibly have deterrence. So the question, stopping the program now, I mean, if your idea is that we're going to get Iran to zero nuclear activity, sort of complete surrender, that's not realistic. It's not going to happen. But if you stop Iran's program now, where there are 8 to 12 months away from having enough material for one bomb, essentially means you're keeping them away many, many years from being a nuclear power. Because countries that we consider nuclear powers have 50, 60, several hundred warheads, whether it's North Korea or it's Pakistan or it's India or it's Israel or it's the US. If Iran needs many years to get to 20, 30 bombs. So stopping the program, slowing it now, essentially doesn't buy you a year. It actually buys you many years.
Okay, let me ask one more question before we turn it over to audience questions. As we're all aware, 3 or 4 years ago, well, I guess it was longer than that, the Stuxnet cyber attack technique was very effective, at least in temporarily halting the centrifuge development and so forth at Natanz and places like that. However, I've read that the feeling amongst the intelligence community is that we, the West, Israel and the US particularly, have lost their advantage in mounting attacks like Stuxnet. Apparently because the Iranians have become keyed into ways to deter those attacks, or perhaps we haven't made any more technological advances which would enable us to continue to delay their development by means of sabotage. I'm just curious what your thoughts were on that.
No, you're absolutely right. It's kind of like regular hacking on our computers. I mean, or the defense of the defenses are built against attacks. So Iranians learned from Stuxnet. They rebuild their program. They have become better at protecting it. There was additional sabotage that happened recently. They found ways to deal with that. The sabotage campaign slows the program, but it doesn't stop it, right? Okay, you will buy a number of months, which is good, but ultimately what you want is that Iran would be permanently that far away from having a nuclear arsenal that would make it then a credible nuclear power. And also, there's the sabotage campaign at some point could escalate to military, right? You never know when it is. Like when the United States assassinated General Soleimani, we almost came to war. when Israelis assassinated an Iranian nuclear scientist in Tehran, we didn't see an immediate reaction. But you never know when that reaction would come. And so this sabotage campaign gets buys you some time, but at a very risky cost. Now, the Stuxnet had a value then because the United States was actually open to dealing with Iran. So Stuxnet persuaded the Iranians that their program has been set back a number of months, and the US is putting both the carrot and the stick at the table at the same time. And so there was an option of a carrot, which was to sign on to the deal. So, you know, that pressure has to go with a pathway forward to potentially a deal, because otherwise it's not a solution it's not a substitute for an actual viable, workable deal.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. How much is Iran's investment in nuclear development worsening its economic situation, and might that result ultimately in a severe political cost to the regime?
The nuclear program is expensive, but its biggest expense is actually sanctions, more so than the actual dollars that goes into a program. But my experience with other countries is that that does not deter countries from going down the path of nuclear program. You know, there was once a Pakistani general who said that we're willing to eat grass, but we're going to protect our nuclear program. And ultimately, at least in 2015, we found out that the Iranians were willing to barter a good chunk of the nuclear program for economic benefits. That is still what's on the table in Vienna. And that's why there may be a way that they would give up 20, 30, 40, 50% of where they are, and they're not as far down the road as Pakistan or North Korea are, in exchange for economic benefits. But I don't see that Iran would give up all of its nuclear program right now. And the reason is this, Tyler. A, what are they giving it up for? Are they giving it up for 2 years of trade and then the United States is going to reverse it? That doesn't seem like a fair deal to them. Last time they believed they were fooled, they were naive. They gave up a lot, and all they got was 2 years of some economic activity and a little bit of money that came directly in the form of cash, which is nothing. And secondly, so the most important question is, what are they giving it up for, right? And that, I think, is the most important thing. And the other issue is that you have to know that if Iran gave up absolutely everything the United States wants, which is get out of the region, hand over your missiles, and also give up your nuclear program, then pretty much it basically means total surrender and sitting in the middle of a region where we're arming the Arabs, we're arming Israel. They have natural, competitors with essentially nothing. And so that's why I don't think it's an easy barter. But the good news is that economics is part of this, right? So once they dealt with the nuclear program in exchange for economic benefit, that's the conversation in Vienna again. And I think for now, the logic of it is that the more money they put into the nuclear program, the more likely they will get a bigger economic benefit at the negotiating table.
Thank you. Here's another question. How close do you think Iran and China are actually getting? Is it primarily an issue of China buying more oil from Iran? We know that. But is the Belt and Road Initiative on China's part a part of a tightening relationship that can become really significant going forward?
Very good question. I mean, they definitely are becoming closer than they were. In fact, the logic of the 2015 deal in the eyes of the former Iranian president and his foreign minister was to anchor Iran's economic relations with Europe and then possibly the US. the maximum pressure has pushed Iran to anchor its economy more in China. And it's not just oil. When Iran was not able to buy any manufacturing capital goods, intermediate goods, raw materials from Europe, it started getting them from China. So the Iranian manufacturers who used to buy European machinery, used to buy European intermediate goods, raw materials in others to make a bag, to make a bottle, to make household goods, are now buying them all from China. And there's sort of the flow of goods and services and businessmen and manufacturing has boomed with China. And that creates a certain relationship. The Belt and Road hasn't fully arrived in Iran, although Iran and China are negotiating some kind of a strategic partnership, but that would be even further. So one of the outcomes of the maximum pressure is that we are pushing Iran more in the direction of China, which also happens to be becoming our main, global strategic rival. That doesn't mean that Iran is a client state of China. It just means that it's moving in that direction, and because of where we are with Iran, there's absolutely no economic linkages with Europe or the US that at a level of middle-class manufacturing business will keep Iran tied to the West.
And here's another audience question. In order to give some sign of guarantee for Iran, would you advise President Biden to seek congressional treaty approval for a new deal?
I don't think treaty is viable. First of all, negotiation of a proper treaty is going to take 2-3 years just to do it. I mean, if you looked at the past 10 years, how many treaties have gone through the US Congress and Senate, the number is literally close to zero. And I think given the opposition that exists to any kind of a deal with Iran in Congress or Senate, it's very difficult that we will end up with a treaty. So almost asking for a treaty is basically asking for failure for the Biden administration. Although you're right that the treaty would provide the maximum amount of guarantee. So the treaty is not an option. The president rightly says that he cannot give a guarantee that is binding to his successor. It has to be something in between, some kind of a creative way that you would say that the Iranians would think that the next American president will not pull out day one, like, that they come into the office. And that this will have legs, and so the two sides have to think what this is. I mean, it may very well be that if there is a deal, that the U.S. would fast track the lifting of sanctions and encourage enough American businesses to have an investment in Iran, that they would basically hold the hand of a future American president coming out. When we came out in 2018 out of the deal, American businesses had not yet even started investing in Iran because the sanctions were coming off so slowly that they didn't lose anything. Whereas European companies lost a huge amount of money. Like one French car maker lost $450 million in investments he had made in starting a car factory in Iran for a market of 80 million people. And if there is that kind of a investment by American businesses, then the U.S. government will not feel as cavalier about pulling out of a deal. It has to be things like that. I mean, you cannot give a formal guarantee, but you have to approach the issue in a way that the Iranians would think January 20th, 2025, with a Republican president is not the end of the deal again.
Let me throw in a question here. The complexity of the Iranian situation goes beyond the nuclear deal and trying to resuscitate it. How about the issue of Iran's militias that are highly active in Iraq, as we know? Could you tell us about those and what is their ultimate intent? Could it be conceivably to totally destabilize the Iraq regime and basically set up a proxy state next door? Or what's the long-term purpose of the militias' interference in Iraq?
I mean, each country's militias are different issue for Iran, but definitely one of the issues that the United States is grappling with is Iran's policies and militias in the region. The first of which was Hezbollah. Now, then it was in Iraq. Now they're also in Yemen and in Syria. They may be in Afghanistan. So this is the way in which Iran has managed its regional affairs. It is both offensive and defensive. So the mindset about Iraq is the following: that Iran and Iraq went to war in 1980. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran and was trying to annex Iran's oil province into Iraq. The same thing he did in Kuwait, he had first done in Iran, wanting to basically eat up territory. Iranians fought tooth and nail over an 8-year period to free their territory without international assistance. Many of the veterans of that war against Iraq are today's commanders of the Revolutionary Guards. For instance, General Soleimani, who was assassinated by the US, was killed by the US, started his career as a foot soldier during in the trenches of the Iran-Iraq war. So for the Iranians, Iraq is a vital strategic issue. The Iranians believe that if Iraq is ever again controlled by a Sunni government, pro-American, close to Saudi Arabia and other Arab states, it will again be a threat to Iran. So the Iranians have a strategic doctrine is called forward defense, which is to defend Iranian borders against Iraq. Iran has to be in Iraq. And therefore, it sees these militias essentially as tentacle of its own regime inside Iraq to make sure that an anti-Iran Iraq will not arise again. And the Iraq-Iran issue is not about the Islamic Republic and Saddam. It goes back to the Shah's time period. From the 1960s, Iraq was the single most important threat to Iran. Iran was pro-America, Iraq was pro-Soviet, and then they had the revolution. And when the Iraqis had an opportunity, they tried to take Iranian territory. Now, Iran doesn't only support militias. Iran bankrolls a huge number of Iraqi politicians. It also, bankrolls Kurdish politicians. It's basically present in Iraq in a way that it can control the future of Iraq so that it doesn't become a threat to Iran. Now, having said that, this kind of a policy is always sticky, and it can and where you start from defense can become offense. Protecting yourself can go beyond the limit. But if you're trying to think about it, logic of what do they want in Iraq? They want to Finlandize Iraq, and they want Iraq to be under their thumb, and to at least not have political developments in Iraq that is out of their control.
Of course, about 2 weeks ago, they actually tried to pop off Mr. Kaduri. Is that not correct? With a missile?
They did, but that was not actually, by most accords, it was not directed from Tehran. You see, the thing about militias is that they're not a clean weapon. They're people and they have their own agendas and their own ambitions. And they lost, the Shia militias lost in a major way in the elections, and they were angry. And they also wanted to sort of show the other power brokers that they still matter and they need to get their pound of flesh in the political setup. But also the assassination of Soleimani, and alongside of it, the major Shia militia commander who was traveling with Soleimani was killed, had a material impact in the sense that there is nobody in Iraq that these smaller groups then became much more independent. In other words, the two people who were eliminated by the US, the Iranian IRGC commander and the Iraqi militia commander, were also people who could control these groups in a much more effective way. By decapitating them, it created a situation where these groups are much more difficult to control because they're now sort of dispersed, if you will.
In answering a prior question, you mentioned the Revolutionary Guard. What is the current kind of interaction between Ayatollah Khamenei, the parliament, and the Revolutionary Guard? Are they all pretty much on the same page, or are there internal conflicts that could be pretty important?
They are on the same page in very broad issues, and Ayatollah Khamenei is the sort of de facto ruler of Iran, even though there's a president, etc. But that does not mean that there are no variations in opinion. I'll give you an example. One of the reasons why Iran took 5 months to come back to negotiating table in Vienna was that there was serious debate within the conservative camp about what should be the Iran's approach to these talks. There are factions within the conservatives who believe that Iran will do better, actually, if it left JCPOA altogether. And there are those who say that, no, Iran should stay in JCPOA, but take a much harder position. And so sometimes these debates actually play out in the Iranian press. I mean, the irony of Iran is that it has a fairly open press when it comes to these things. You don't criticize the supreme leader, but there could be plenty of criticism of government and varieties of other issues. And some of it is done behind closed doors. So, I mean, even right now, coming back from Vienna, there's hot debates in Iranian press about how to interpret the strategy of the Iranian nuclear team in Vienna. Was it successful? Was it not successful? Was it the right track or not? It's in the editorial pages of the newspapers. So yes, there is diversity of opinion. It has narrowed since the moderates have been kicked out of the presidency and are now marginal to the parliament. But much like, let's say, different wings of the Republican Party we would think about in the US, there are these different wings within Iran, and then the supreme leader is not the absolute ruler of Iran. I mean, he is powerful by virtue of navigating and building consensus and playing one faction against the other, and making sure that, you know, he gradually corrals all of the public opinion in the direction that he wants.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. What do Arab governments really want when they negotiate with Iran?
Well, I mean, at some level, there is rivalry between Iran and the Arabs that precedes, you know, the Islamic Republic and all of this. I mean, this is kind of like, at some level, these are regional powers, each of whom thinks that they should be top dog. Turkey's in there too. Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they all think they should be the primo in the Middle East. So behind the veneer of, these are Islamists, we're not. There is also real rivalry. If Iran tomorrow became a democratic pro-Western state, that rivalry is not going to go away. It's not like the Arab countries would then defer to Iran immediately to become a major ally of the United States and a major voice in the Gulf. But very immediately, I think they're very concerned with the potential of conflict. Like if let's say there is major conflict between the United States and Iran, and it plays out in the Persian Gulf, it's going to hugely damage the economies of the Gulf countries. I mean, who would want to fly with Emirates Airlines into Dubai if there is threat of missiles, right? Or if the Iranians decide that in retaliation for an Israeli attack, now they're going to hit a target in UAE because UAE is not an ally of Israel, right? Then that could damage business, it could damage tourism, it could do many, many things. Saudis, on the other hand, are worried about Yemen. They're worried about attacks, drone attacks on their facilities that are coming either from Yemen or Iraq. Both of them have realized that by posturing as an absolute enemy of Iran and first of all, lobbying against the nuclear deal of 2015 in Washington, and then allying themselves with maximum pressure against Iran, they basically, that situation of being a hard enemy of Iran has put them in danger. So the main purpose of the conversation with Iran is de-escalation, is to sort of move towards some degree of normalization that then would provide some guarantees that maybe in the event of a conflict, they will not end up being sucked into it. And I think in 2015, they were worried about the United States having a deal with Iran. Now they might be more worried about no deal with Iran. Because if there's no deal with Iran and we go down the path we discussed earlier that may end up in conflict, could put them in great jeopardy.
And speaking about various attacks, I noticed with interest that there haven't been any efforts by the Iranians to attack foreign tankers in the Persian Gulf in the last several months. And now previous to that, there were quite a few. I'm just curious whether that's telling us something about just abandoning that tactic because frankly, it wasn't very effective, or what else might it indicate? If anything.
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily they've abandoned it. For whatever reason, they've decided not to do anything right now. Maybe it has to do with how sensitive a situation there is in Vienna. I think all of these attacks by Iran since 2019 were designed to send signals, both to the countries in the region and the United States, that look, choking Iran is not going to be cost-free. That don't assume that you could just basically keep squeezing our economy and then meanwhile carry on with business as if it doesn't mean anything to you. That we can cause trouble. We can, although let's say initially they were very careful not to hit Europe. Often they targeted tankers whose flags would be less politically problematic. Either they would be UAE flag or Norway flag. There's only one case in which a British citizen was killed in an attack. They wanted to show both willingness and capability, right? The purpose of hitting Saudi oil facilities was to showcase their military technology, because they completely took the defense systems by surprise. So why did they want to showcase that? To say, look, don't assume you can go to war with us and it's going to be easy. You may not know what we have. And secondly, was to show willingness, that they're capable and willing to do it. And therefore, maximum pressure should not be pursued without the United States rethinking about it. So I would say that if talks go south, if we end up in a bad situation, I think nobody knows whether Iran would resume it or would actually do something altogether different.
This is going maybe a touch far afield, but I wonder what your thoughts are in the future for Syria. It's hard to conjure up any hope that they can ever reunite as a single country anytime in the near future, but maybe I'm too pessimistic about that.
Well, it's a slow process. I mean, first of all, Assad has survived and he's tightening his hold over the country economically, politically. Eventually, some refugees will go back. Many will not, but the populations that's within Syria will, in one way or the other, be living under the Assad regime. But parts of the country are still occupied and not under his control. So the Kurdish region in the north is still occupied by Turkish forces. There is a part of the north west of the country, the Idlib province, which is an Arab province where most of the opposition and fighters that were fighting against the Assad regime are holed up, is protected by Turkey. And so even reintegration of that territory into Syria is not a given in the short run. It may take a much longer time period. So I think where we are is that the war has ended. At least the internal war with Turkey may resume between Syria and Turkey over that territory, but the war within has ended. But there is very slow process of political consolidation and showing what the path forward is. Except right now, nobody expects that anybody other than Assad would be ruling Syria in the near future.
Amal, it looked like you have a question.
I do. Let me pose the last question for our distinguished guest. Several administrations of the United States have thought, if not to pivot to the Chinese area, but at least to rebalance our approach. given all the troubles you have described and the troubles we have lived through for generations in the Middle East, is that aspiration of the United States really in doubt?
Look, it's the correct aspiration, but the problem we have is that in order to be able to address that, we had to execute. And I think the 2015 deal by President Obama was the right step, whatever the shortcomings, et cetera, because he understood that if the United States is going to focus its energies on containing China or taking advantage of the economic situation in Asia, it has to reduce its military engagement in the Middle East. So he decided not to go on the ground war in Libya. He decided not to intervene in Syria. He abandoned the peace process pretty much. But he also understood that the single biggest issue in the region that could bring the United States into a war, and a much worse war than the ones before, is with Iran. So the 2015 nuclear deal was not a solution to the Iran problem, but provided the United States with enough room to actually focus on Asia. Then came President Trump, who actually had a confusing policy of simultaneously wanting to shift to focus on China, and yet escalated with Iran in a way that almost brought him to war. So it was a contradictory policy. Now, President Biden, again, wants to focus on China, but he needs to get out of the Middle East, and especially he cannot afford a major crisis with Iran. And that's why the talks in Vienna are very important, not only for containing Iran's nuclear program, but actually for the ambition that American foreign policy has. If we end up in a war with Iran, we can kiss containing China goodbye. The biggest beneficiary of a major costly war in the Middle East will be China. So we have to decide what's more important, China or Iran. And we have to think strategically that way.
Is Afghanistan part of that question?
Let me hit you with one more question we got from the audience just at the last minute. And it does bring up the issue of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. Do you think it's conceivable that Iran and the US would get together to help bail out Afghanistan and deal with its terrible economic and humanitarian problems, and perhaps that could improve the climate, so to speak, going forward in terms of our relations with them?
I think it's possible. The Iranians were pivotal in the Bonn conference of 2000 and in helping the United States overthrow the Taliban. But immediately after that, they were put on the axis of evil, which, again, goes to our back and forth with them. The Iranians allowed US overflight over their territory to rescue soldiers. They helped in the Bonn conference craft a new constitution. It's doable. But I think the Gordian knot is the nuclear deal in Vienna. If there's no progress there, if there's no trust building there, then these other issues are very difficult to tackle. And for Iran and for the United States both, it has to begin over there. And we have to be in a mindset that the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good, right? If we can get to a good deal, a sufficiently good deal like the 2015 deal was, we should embrace it and then build on top of it with things that you're mentioning, and build our broader foreign policy on Asia on the assumption that we can have a manageable Middle East. But if we're going with the perfect with Iran, that it has to be zero nuclear, it has to be behaving here, it has to be behaving there, it has to be more democratic, observe human rights, et cetera, then that's a recipe for sitting in the Middle East for a very long period.
Tyler, I thank you. And I want to thank Professor Vali Nasr for his insights, his effective discussion today on a really complex subject. I also want to offer our thanks to Tyler for bringing this program to us and hosting it for us. We want to thank Joan and Kerry and all the folks at the library who do their business to help us, and we really help. Thank all of you who've participated over the years. I'm going to ignore them.
It beats a barking dog, right?
Well, but not by much. I want to reiterate to you that in a few weeks, we will send you all our people, the program for 2022, which is just about fully cooked. We want to thank you for your participation from where you're at. Until we meet again, a happy and healthy holidays and a positive start to the new year.
Thank
I'm
you.
leaving.
Thank you.